I thought I'd do a quick comparison between two classic service pistols that are quite different but accomplish the same task. One in America, one in the Soviet Union. We have the Smith & Wesson Model 10 and Soviet PM Makarov. Both weapons actually are similar in power. Model 10, also known as the military police, also known as the hand ejector 38, and a bunch of other nicknames, fires 38 special generally. The Makarov fires 9x18 millimeter. These two cartridges are extremely similar in power, if not in in external dimensions. Both fire an approximately 9mm bullet. The 38 Special is typically loaded with a much heavier bullet that goes slower. The Makarov is loaded with a very light bullet that goes a little bit faster, but as far as energy-wise, they are extremely similar. I have them displayed here in their respective service holsters. There were several different types available for the Makarov, and there were many types for the Smith & Wesson. But these are relatively common styles. This one was made by Don Hume. I'm not exactly sure when it was made. Probably sometime in the 70s, if I had to guess. But it's similar to, it's a fairly typical style. Now the belt hanger on this is rigid, probably in the belief that it would be a little bit quicker to draw that way. As you can see, the Makarov holster seals up the weapon quite well. If so far as carrying the pistol, Makarov holster would do an excellent job of keeping the weapon clean in sort of a military context, though it would not be as quick. It also has a spare magazine pouch and a holder, of course, for the cleaning rod / screwdriver. In a quick draw competition, though, I think this would be significantly better, though. It's not going to be very easy to draw one-handed anyway. There. We have our old Smith & Wesson. And pull this tab to help you... this holster has a tab, in case you didn't know, that helps you draw the pistol. Like that. And no, I don't have a spare magazine in there right now. This holster is a Russian model, and it's dated 1989, though it looks like it was pretty much unissued. Comparing the holsters, they really represent different design philosophies. This, of course, is sort of a multi-function pistol case, I guess you might say. Whereas this is more of a, what we in the West tend to think of as a traditional holster. The leather is thicker and a little bit stiffer. Enough talk about holsters. Oh! I do also have this holster. This was an old Air Force issue holster that they used with the Smith & Wesson Combat Masterpiece Model 15, which is basically this pistol, but with target sights and a target trigger, I believe, and an underlug barrel. But it's also a lightweight, if I'm not mistaken. This holster I got pretty much in unissued condition, and it was made by Buckheimer in 1968, as you can see there. Move the holsters out of the way. Now, These handguns are similar in size and similar in weight. The Makarov is a bit lighter. The Makarov, I'm going to go ahead and say it, I think is definitely represented a better weapon than the Smith & Wesson. The Smith & Wesson is a design that dates to 1899. There have been numerous changes over the years, but the same basic revolver has remained in production almost ever since. There was a brief period in the mid-2000s where it was out of production. But when these were actually being issued to lawmen, they weren't really any better than the models that rolled off the line in 1899. They were just a little bit safer and more durable. But the Smith & Wesson, first I'll point out the good things about it. It had a very good trigger, and as far as iron sights go, as far as fixed iron sights go, it's a pretty good sight picture, actually. Better than Makarov. The Makarov sights are not the worst sights I've ever seen, but they're also not far from the worst sights I've ever seen. Smith & Wesson, on the other hand, still not modern, but we're getting there. Smith & Wesson has a much better trigger than the Makarov, and both these pistols have been. I'll go ahead and check it for the camera. See, nothing there, and nothing there. Smith & Wesson has a better double action pull, as well as a better single action pull. Makarov is not bad. By the way, in Russian, it should be pronounced Makarov. Not Makarov, not Makarov, not Makarov, Makarov. Pistolet Makarov. I sort of alternate between a little bit of a Russian pronunciation and an English pronunciation. You know, I knew about the Makarov pistol long before I ever started learning Russian, but the Smith & Wesson, this particular one, I've added a grip adapter. That was a common modification in the days when Smith & Wessons were common weapons. These Magna grips, or stocks, as Smith & Wesson likes to call them, they were supposed to represent an improvement over the older service stocks, but not much of one. It's still a rather thin grip, but when you add the grip adapter, it's not bad. It feels a little bit more like a Ruger Bisley to me. Makarov, on the other hand, there are aftermarket grips, but I actually kind of like the factory grip, and the red star grips are just so iconic, I wouldn't change them. The big advantage the Makarov represents is, of course, it has an 8-shot magazine versus the 6-shot cylinder of the Smith & Wesson, and it's probably a little bit quicker to change magazines on the Makarov, though honestly neither one of them is very fast. There were a number of different techniques police officers used over the years, ranging from just single loading to double loading. There were speed strips, and of course there were speed loaders. These are HKS speed loaders. They're not the best type. I believe Safariland was better respected. But both of these could be pressed into service for personal protection, but they are both very, very old-fashioned guns at this point. And I just find it interesting how comparing the design philosophies of both. The Smith & Wesson is very much in sort of the old American craftsmanship style. It's much more complicated. A lot of people think that revolvers are simpler than automatics, but that is just not the case. Especially not when comparing Makarov. Makarov is an extremely simple pistol, whereas I have never actually disassembled a Smith & Wesson revolver because I know enough to know that it looks kind of nightmare, like a clockwork nightmare to me. Makarov, on the other hand, is even simpler than a Glock. Both of them have fixed barrels, of course, and similar sight radiuses, actually, almost the same. But while the Smith & Wesson features this sort of old American craftsmanship and is, it was already an antique when this one was made. This one was made in 1984, by the way, whereas this one was made in 79. Makarov is a Bulgarian model, in case anyone didn't know. But the Bulgarian models are very similar to the Russians. The Russian Makarov changed over the years. They added different updates to simplify the design. Eventually they added investment cast hammers and triggers and safety levers and stamped, simple pressed sheet metal ejectors slash slide stops. Cool thing about a Makarov is most of the parts accomplish more than one task. This is not only the slide stop, but it's also the ejector. Whereas the Russians started doing investment casting and things like that, the Bulgarians stayed with classic milling. They represent a little bit more of the original Makarov design, at least the 1955 Makarov design, I should say, rather than the changes the Russians made over the years. I wouldn't say that one is necessarily better than the other, but it's nice that a Bulgarian is a pretty good representation of the breed, the classic breed. Magazines changed some over the years. I do not know off the top of my head. I think originally they had magazines with sort of a bulge here to conceal this tab on the magazine, loading tab. Then they deleted the bulge and just had this open space here. But the Russians went back and forth. The Bulgarians pretty much, going off of memory, they stayed with more or less one pattern. But I have no idea if this is a Russian or a Bulgarian model because they don't include any markings. This is, however, not one of the later aftermarket magazines. This is an actual period magazine. I do have some of the modern aftermarket magazines as well. Those you can identify because they're made out of a little bit thinner sheet metal, and they do have the bulge there, concealing this gap here. And they have this really sort of chintzy looking aluminum, I'd say cast aluminum base plate. I don't think there's any problem with them, and reports seem to say they're reliable. I've had reliability with a little bit I've used mine, but I definitely like the look and feel of the Soviet era rather than the more modern magazines. The Makarov, I tend to ramble and I tend to get easily distracted. Whereas the Smith & Wesson represents classic American quality and sort of an old-fashioned classic shooting style. This very much represents the Soviet picture of modernity during the post-war era. It was made extremely simple. It was made cheaply from the sense that it was inexpensive for them to produce them, but it was made out of high quality materials. They did not put a whole lot of polish on areas that didn't need polish, though they did, they did polish the slides and things like that on the exterior surfaces pretty well. But they very much left some areas. There were a lot of tool marks, but they perfectly functional, extremely reliable handgun. Sometimes people say better 6 for sure, but in some ways, I'm not sure. If you were to do a mud test or something, I am sure the Makarov would beat the pants off of a Smith & Wesson revolver. But so far as just ordinary shooting, I've never had a problem with either. Let's look at the grips on them. These are very obviously very old, worn walnut Magna grips. We've got the little Smith & Wesson medallion on each side. Interestingly, one side is sort of gold colored on this one, while the other, I think it started out as gold, but all the plating has been worn away. Check out the patina on this. You had wood and steel on the Smith, whereas the Makarov has these sort of modeled Bakelite grips. I'm really not saying anything that an actual enthusiast of these pistols would not know. Keep on flashing the serial number, which I don't like doing, but I guess I'm mostly just admiring them. I've already dry fired the Smith. Let's dry fire the Makarov. While the Smith definitely has a superior trigger, the trigger on the Makarov is actually pretty nice as well. Neither one is particularly heavy. The Smith just has that extremely smooth rolling break to it, whereas the Makarov, it's got a little bit of a stage to it. It's maybe slightly heavier on the double action. Single action is a little bit creepy, but not bad. Single action on the Smith, on the other hand, is ridiculously short and crisp. The saying that the Smith & Wesson trigger is better than the Makarov is absolutely no knock on the Makarov. The Smith & Wesson revolver triggers, particularly the older revolver triggers, this one was made in the mid '80s when Smith & Wesson was a little bit of a low point. But the Smith & Wesson revolver triggers are amazingly good. I have a friend who had a SIG P226 Legion, probably a $1,200 pistol with a highly tuned trigger from the custom shop. This was a better trigger than that. I myself had a Beretta PX4 Storm that I added a Langdon trigger job and a bag to. And while that was an excellent trigger, this old Smith was still better. Not bad from a revolver that I got for about $300. It's definitely seen some better days. Condition-wise, my Makarov is, I'd say, in excellent condition, whereas this one is has a bit of a patina to it. This one supposedly came from a foreign country. I've tried to figure out where it's from. I've found lots of speculation. It's marked JP 4843. There were a bunch of these JP marked Smiths that came in at one time. I've seen people speculate that JP stood for Japanese police, which seems unlikely to me. I would imagine they would use, Japanese kanji to write in. I've seen people speculate Juarez, Jalisco, various places in Spain or France. I've even seen Jakarta and Jordan speculated. I don't know. To me, it seems most likely that it was from a Spanish-speaking country, or at least some country that uses Latin lettering. But I never, no one ever seemed to have those pinned down. I could get a factory letter from Smith & Wesson that would probably clarify it, but I'd have to spend almost as much on the letter as I did on the revolver, so I'm not going to do that. I've always sort of mentally compared these two. This was an extremely widespread handgun during the Cold War. It was, this wasn't the only revolver, certainly, that was used, but this was probably the most popular revolver that was issued to American police, and it was also issued throughout much of the West as well. It did see military service, though it was definitely more of a police weapon than a military weapon. And this one, of course, was made in 4 different countries and exported to many more as well. So, obviously, the big difference between them is you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody still using these. Probably some third world police departments, but not many other people. This, on the other hand, is still very much in frontline use. I don't know that it's, officially the Russian military has adopted more modern designs. Pistolet Yagarin, I believe. Yagarin. But I've never seen a PEA. I've seen, whenever I've been in Russia, the only handgun you see ever is the Makarov, and you see a fair amount of those. Every police officer you see packs a Makarov. Many of them in holsters just like this. Traffic cops will oftentimes have them in white. I've seen the white holsters sometimes referred to as parade holsters in America. That's not really the case. I'm sure the white holsters are used for parade use, but they're used, by traffic officers as well. You see the brown holsters also. I don't want to imply that all police get white holsters, whereas the military is brown. That's not the case. You see both colors, though. I believe you also see black holsters, which were issued exclusively to the naval infantry, but I've never actually seen a black holster in person. But when I was in Russia, my wife, I commented how all the cops, they're trying to dress in more modern tactical gear, wearing body armor over their uniforms and things like that a lot of times, but this is still the pistol they're packing. But she said that the Makarov really is the Glock of Russia, and that's probably a good way of thinking of it. But they're comparable. If you were to have some scenario where you had 2 more or less equally trained people, one armed with the Smith and one armed with a Makarov, of course, the handguns wouldn't be the deciding factor. both could get the job done about as well as the other. They just accomplish it in different ways. One last thing. I saw on a video somewhere, under the video, someone mentioned something about their Makarov's questionable phallic grips. I have had Makarovs for a number of years. But I had never seen it. But once he mentioned phallic grips, I know exactly what he's talking about. It does kind of look like a circumcised penis, doesn't it? That's fun. In addition to guns, I'm a big fan of shooting and gun books. This was my very first shooting book. I actually had to re-buy it recently because I threw away my original. But it's the year 2000 edition of the Shooter's Bible. I remember getting it for Christmas, in 2000. And this was my first exposure to the Makarov. It had an article called Handguns in the Old Millennium. And it discussed auto pistol development in the 20th century. But I remember seeing this picture of a Makarov. Notice the ZZ serial number and the little screw on the rear sight. This is actually a Chinese model, which pretty rare. But it says, the remarkable Makarov pistol, developed by the Soviet Union shortly after World War II, combined advanced design elements from various foreign pistols to produce a simple but durable model. And in the text it said that after World War II, the pace of military handgun development slowed, but with a few notable exceptions. One was the Soviet Union's Makarov pistol, which was produced in 1951 as the Pistolet Makarov, or PM, and featured a double-action trigger system. Compared to the Walther, the PM was simpler, stronger, and fired a more powerful cartridge, the 9mm Parabellum. Absolutely false. It was a more powerful cartridge, but 9mm Parabellum, it was not. But I just found that interesting. This was a very influential book on me, actually, that my mother gave me back then. I remembered combing through it for years and years through it. I mean, all throughout high school and even after, that article got me interested in Makarovs before I ever even saw one. Then the first time I went to Russia, I absolutely had to have one after that. This one I purchased the day my wife and I were going to go out to our honeymoon. There was a gun show in town, and me and my shooting buddy were going to go. And on the very first table, almost the very first gun I saw was this baby. Had a price tag of $160. And even back then, $160 was a steal for it. Now these probably go for about $500. At the time, they were going for about $250 to $300 generally. But I went and I got some cash, handed it to the gentleman that was selling it, and I told my shooting buddy, I said, all right, let's go. So we were at the gun show for a grand total of about 30 minutes, and most of that time was running the background check. Incidentally, for anyone that is not familiar with American gun shows, people on the left oftentimes talk about the gun show loophole, as if people don't have to run through background checks at gun shows. They do. There's nothing special about a gun show, and the sales work the same there as they do anywhere else. But I've had it ever since. And this one I actually bought while my mom was in the hospital with dying of cancer. I mean, she wasn't actually dying at the time, but she was hospitalized with cancer, and I wound up Just kind of impulse buying this one. I guess doing a little bit of retail therapy, as they say. All right. Well, I've rambled enough. That's about it.